about 6 today, and the agenda, we're gonna eliminate item 7, which is executive session.
Okay, what do I do here?
With that, we'll entertain a motion to approve the agenda.
I'll move.
Second.
Moved and seconded to approve the agenda. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Approval of the April 9th minutes. Any additions or corrections?
Make a motion, we approve.
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Director's report. Kristen, I think, is going to take this for us.
Sure thing. Thanks, Mr. Chair. Just have two things to bring to your attention today. The first is an announcement of our monthly webinar series. The next webinar is taking place tomorrow in this room from 2 to 3, and the topic is on maintaining bike, ped, and transit infrastructure. So that's, if you're interested, we'd welcome your attendance. We've had really great attendance of between 10 to 20 people every session. So please come if you're interested. And the second item we wanted to bring to your attention during the director's report was our monthly update of our estimate of the year-end balance for May. As of May 1st, there's been no change since our update in April. So we're still estimating around $410,000 we'll have at the end of the year this year. Thank you.
To approve consent agenda.
Second.
Consent agenda, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Public comment, if anybody is here to like to address, if you'd go to the podium and state your name, please. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Jane Burns. I live in Wichita, Kansas. I belong to a variety of organizations such as the League of Women Voters, Bike Walk Wichita, healthy things. I teach at WSU. I'm not speaking on behalf of any of them. I am a registered licensed dietitian. I know the value of physical activity to folks' health. So I'm really speaking on behalf of the hundreds or thousands of patients and clients that I've seen over my career who would benefit from greater physical activity if it were safe. Let me tell you some of the health benefits of physical activity. Can help prevent breast and colon cancer, helps prevent cancer of the bladder, endometrium, esophagus, kidney, stomach, and lung. It reduces the risk of dementia, including Alzheimer's, heart disease, stroke, high blood pressure, type 2 diabetes, and depression. It improves bone health and overall quality of life. I could go on, but the point of my ask here is to ask you within your communities, within your constituencies, to enable, facilitate, empower, and most of all, fund the safety and access of physical activity. I'm talking sidewalks, painted crosswalks on those sidewalks, bike lanes, multi-use recreational patterns for all. Not only those strong, wonderful, powerful recreational bicyclists, but also students and low income and seniors and millennials, to empower them to take care of their health every day by walking and biking, enjoying the fresh air, enjoying your communities at the same time. Thank you so much. Except if there are any questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anybody else like to address? Come on up.
Okay. All right. All right. I'm Kent Rowe, but I'll be speaking later.
Right, anybody else? Okay, moving on. Item 4, new business. B, action project selection criteria. Chris?
Thank you. So, first item for you today I have to talk about is our project selection criteria for the new MTP, our Metropolitan Transportation Plan. That's our long-range 20-year planning document. This summer, WAMPO will be putting out a call for projects, asking all of our member jurisdictions and planning partners to submit their projects that you'd like to see potentially get WAMPO funded over the next 20 years. We've been talking about the menu at some of your recent past meetings. Well, this is how you get on the menu, how you get your project on there. The call for projects will be issued in June, and we're looking at the project proposals being due in August. So we anticipate that during that call for projects, we're going to get more people asking for WAMPO funding than we are going to have available. We'll get more projects than we can fit into the plan. So how do we winnow this down? How do we select projects? At the heart of this is the Project Selection Committee. It's going to be a small group, a mixture of policy body members and TAC members appointed by the chair, that will do the bulk of the work in terms of winnowing down that list, coming up with a list that they can recommend the policy body that will then have the final approval over what projects get into the plan. So while the policy body makes the ultimate decision, the bulk of the work is done by that selection committee. Now, we don't just want to drop 100 projects on those poor folks on the selection committee without some sort of structure to help them figure out what the best projects are, what ones should go into the plan. So to do that, we have a set of selection criteria. These are ways to help us judge the projects. Now, it's important to note that the selection committee is not a slave to the selection criteria. We want the committee to take a larger, more holistic view. The criteria don't dictate what projects get selected, but they're a tool that the selection committee can use to help them come up with their recommended list. So we have 8 selection criteria. These were crafted based on the vision and the outcomes and investment strategy that we have talked about at recent meetings and that the policy body has adopted. The 8 criteria are quality of place, the land use transportation connection, multimodal connectivity, economic development, financial sustainability, regionalism, safety, and technology. So those are the 8 areas we're looking at. And in each of these areas, a project would get a rating. Rating could be excellent, good, acceptable, unacceptable, or not applicable. And that last one's important because we're going to get a lot of different types of projects. Not all 8 criteria are going to apply to every project. So not applicable isn't something that counts against you. It just means your project doesn't fit this particular criteria. Now, as I said, there's a lot of diversity of projects that we anticipate receiving. Road projects, bridge projects, transit, bike ped, safety, air quality, planning projects, frankly, other projects that staff haven't even considered. Y'all are very creative, have jurisdictions with lots of different needs. We are going to see lots of different types of projects. So how do we come up with 1 criteria or even just 8 criteria that can judge every project? Well, we can't. So the way we're tackling this is having multiple routes to getting a rating on each of these criteria. There's lots of different ways that you can demonstrate, for instance, that your project contributes to economic development. So I'm going to use this one as an example, but this applies to every one of those 8 criteria. On an economic development, the economic development rating, for instance, you can get a high rating by serving a major freight facility, by improving access to jobs, specifically via transit, but also via road or any other mode, and increasing travel time reliability. So you get a diverse set of projects. You could have a road project that is improving a roadway adjacent to a cluster of warehouses that ship and receive a lot of truck traffic. That could get a high rating by serving a major freight facility. Maybe you're extending operating hours on a transit route that serves a bunch of employment, improving access to jobs via transit. Maybe we're upgrading a road, adding turn lanes or signalizing an intersection near a major employer where it clogs up at the shift change as a lot of people are coming in or going out. And maybe we're coordinating traffic signals along a corridor that sees a lot of truck traffic, increasing the travel time reliability. So 4 totally different types of projects, road, transit, technology, all of which contribute to economic development in different ways, and all of which could score well on these criteria because we have these different alternative ways to get a rating. So I'm not going to go through every one of the selection criteria at that level of detail. It runs like 12 pages, and it's in your packet if you want to have a look. But I do want to briefly summarize sort of what we're looking at with each of these criteria. Starting with the quality of place criteria, we've talked a lot about attracting and retaining talent here in the policy body and in WAMPO more generally. And quality of place is one of the areas where we're really trying to do that. So in this criteria, we're looking at access to destinations like schools, recreation, healthcare, walkability aspects, help creating nice walkable neighborhoods, and placemaking, which is a little more nebulous, but basically the projects that contribute to the character of a neighborhood or a place, help make it an attractive place to live. Also linked with that attracting and retaining talent is these criteria built around land use and how that connects to transportation. So here we're looking at projects that serve denser areas of development, maybe infill development or transit-oriented development. For example, we've been talking about extending transit service out to some of our outlying communities. If we could coordinate the land use with that, that would help on this criteria. Mixed-use development, having multiple uses in one area, and things like town centers and historic downtowns. On the multimodal connectivity front, this is where we really lean into transit and bike ped, so extending the bicycle pedestrian network and particularly connecting up unconnected areas. On transit service, this includes new routes, but also things like reducing headways and increasing operating hours. The operating hours is one thing where we've heard a lot from employers that maybe our current level of transit service doesn't cover enough of the day to help hit folks that are maybe going to a non-traditional shift. Also, there's a particular emphasis here on bringing transit and bike ped to some of our low-income, minority, or elderly communities. And then transit access to things like schools, recreation, and healthcare. Economic development, I kind of already covered. Financial sustainability, we're really looking at 2 pillars. One of those is preservation. This is sort of a continuation of something we talked about a lot in Move 2040, our current long-range plan of preserving and maintaining. In particular, we're emphasizing preventing facilities from deteriorating until they're in poor condition. It's usually cheaper to keep them in good condition than to let them go to pot and then try and fix them. Also downsizing facilities where that's appropriate. If we have more capacity than is really required, you could get some points here as well. On the funding side, we have lots of needs and a limited amount of funding. One way to deal with that is to bring new money into the system. So we're encouraging folks to look at new funding sources, innovative funding possibilities. Regionalism, this is where we look at regional significance. Every project WAMPO funds has to be regionally significant, but we all know some projects are more significant than others. We're also looking at projects here that involve multiple jurisdictions. This is something that sort of emerged on an ad hoc basis when we did our most recent TIP, particularly the cities sometimes had projects going right up to the city boundary, and the county said, it would make sense if we maybe extended that a little further beyond the municipal boundaries. That would be a more logical stopping point. We're encouraging folks to have those sorts of conversations up front and have cooperation between adjacent cities or the city and the county. Also looking at projects that connect WAMPO with the larger South Central Kansas region. Now, we can only spend our money within our planning area. That's a federal requirement. But we still can have projects, for example, on highways that connect up to, Hutchinson or El Dorado or some of our larger region. Safety, I'll be talking about this more a little later, but we're looking at accident history, eliminating car-bicycle conflicts through things like protected lanes and pedestrian signals, incorporating roundabouts, that sort of thing. And then finally on technology, there's an emphasis here on connected and automated vehicles, a long list of specific technologies we'd like to see. One twist on this, we have identified through our Transportation Systems Management and Operations Task Force some corridors that we think would be good priorities for technology investment. And while we encourage technology on every project, particularly on those corridors, projects along there, we'd like to see technology investments. And then there's some here for coordinating among multiple jurisdictions, and even for projects where the final project doesn't incorporate technology, using things like smart work zones during the construction phase. So those are the 8 selection criteria and a very brief overview of each. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Chris, can you do me a favor? Do you know Jay Russell, developer? You don't? Okay. I'll have to get you in touch with him. He's asked me a couple times, and I know he's talked to Councilman Bluebaugh, Mayor Bluebaugh over in Goddard, to Dr. Henry over at USD 265 in Goddard. But he's interested in some sidewalks going from the city of Wichita down Maple over towards the city of Goddard, and then down 167th over to the schools to make it safer to get the kids over to school. And so I think that he needs to start submitting some of this paperwork, so I was hoping that you could get with him so that you can walk him through the process to get his project that he's interested in at least considered.
Sure thing. I'd be happy to speak with him.
So one thing I noticed at the beginning is that the TAC seems to be phased out of things. I personally rely on the TAC for my information. And I'm kind of wondering why the TAC isn't what essentially the initial look at these projects, and rather than a committee maybe including a couple people in the TAC. Why not the TAC? They're the experts.
So you're referring to the project selection committee for this? Yeah, one of the things we found, this was one of the real lessons learned from the Move 2040 process, is the smaller the group is, the easier this gets. This will be a very time-consuming process, among other things. We're probably looking at 6 or 8 multiple-hour meetings over about a 2-month period this fall, and that's an awful lot to ask everyone on the TAC to do. It's also just easier to discuss these and come to a decision in a smaller group. So this is sort of following the pattern we've set with the past 2 TIP project selection processes. Is we have about a 5 or 6 person committee that includes representatives from both the TAC and the policy body to take this first cut at it.
I'm just looking for expertise. It's I rest of the folks in here, but I don't.
And we really do try and get the technical expertise on that selection committee panel. There's usually some engineering focused folks from the TAC on there.
The last selection committee, you had, 3 engineers on that selection committee. One from Wichita, one from Sedgwick, and myself. Who else was on there? We had a gentleman from outside the organization, so.
Yeah, I believe for the last TIP selection committee, it was yourself, Jim Weber, Paul Gunzelman, Ann, and let's see, Zach McHatton and Darius Wright, who was our public representative.
TAC was pretty well wrapped on. I mean, we had 3 engineers on that. Pete, you had something, and then I'll get to you, Rico.
Yeah, I was just going to ask Chris. So these 8 categories of selection criteria, is that like best practices from other MPOs or something? Or where'd we get the eight?
They're really based on the vision and goals, sort of teasing out the main themes in those and into areas that we could group them, the vision and the outcome statements, excuse me.
Not from other MPOs?
Well, the idea behind selection criteria anywhere is they focus on the things that you think are important, which is what these vision and goals should embody. For other areas, the things that are important to them may be different. For example, there are lots of places that have much worse congestion problems than we do and place a lot of emphasis on that. There are other areas that have much more robust transit systems and place a lot more emphasis on the transit side of things. So we tried to reflect based on WAMPO's needs and our local circumstances and what this body has said that they're interested in seeing in crafting these.
A quick question in terms of the last go around. Have these categories or criteria changed from the last time? Have there been some that were added, removed, or is this the same category from the last time?
There have been some changes. A lot of stuff got rolled over. We sort of reorganized things. The TIP project selection criteria sort of aggregated over several years and kind of needed some reorganization. And then we incorporated some new things based on those vision and goals. A lot of the talent retention type stuff is a new emphasis that wasn't really there in the past, for instance.
And just another comment, perhaps if you could, as a recommendation, maybe make a spot for the project selection committee, maybe a representative, an engineer from the smaller communities to participate in this as well. You did mention Wichita, Sedgwick County. Okay, very good. So we do have representation there.
Yeah, we definitely try and get a diversity of geographic and city sizes in terms of who's represented on that selection committee that fairly represents all of WAMPO.
And just a last quick question. These criteria that were developed for this year, were these discussed at the TAC meeting? Was it that group that created this criteria?
So they were created by staff, and then we've discussed them with our Plan Advisory Committee, which is our group of TAC and policy body members that are specifically advising on the MTP update.
Thank you, Dan. Chris, I have some questions on how are you going to operationalize this? Right now, this seems to be qualitative, not quantitative, and it also doesn't show any weighting for the criteria. So I'm thinking I could do a street project that's going to, which could be just a collector street in my community that's going to improve access to schools, and I'm going to check a number of boxes and probably get excellence, and yet it does nothing to move us forward on regionalism or projects of regional significance, right? How do we work through those issues? And is it who gets more excellence in the boxes, or it's?
So sort of taking those as two questions in terms of the operationalization of these, the individual criteria. The version of this in the packet that I didn't delve too deeply into here, it does have specific numbers. Different sizes of schools, for instance, could get different ratings, that sort of thing. In terms of weighting the different criteria,
They'll come up. You don't get a number, though.
you don't get a number. You get those for
excellent, good.
the different categories
Right,
here.
exactly. I got that.
There we go.
Right.
In terms of the weighting, this is something that sort of came out of the Move 2040 process, which was quite contentious. We decided not to have a specific weighting for this, and that has worked well for the TIP project selection process, essentially leaving it to the selection committee to look at these different criteria and try and get a range of projects, again, looking holistically, that move forward all of these different areas. It could be some projects are very strong in one or two areas, and they're strong enough in those particular areas that they're worthy of inclusion. Could be other projects that are maybe not quite as good in particular areas, but are strong across the board. And part of the selection committee's job is to try and take into account these differences and come up with a good slate of projects that help meet the needs of a wide variety of WAMPO's member jurisdictions.
There are some basic principles in Move 2040, though, that are, we consider to be priorities, right? In terms of maintenance of our current infrastructure, addressing safety issues, regionalism is discussed throughout the plan, right? Well, I think it's, Dan, that's my concern. I'm not quite sure what kind of guidance that committee is going to need as they go forward from the policy group. Otherwise, I think they're shooting in the dark a little bit on priorities. I know ultimately this group will make that decision, but there's going to be a whole lot of projects that are thrown at you at once, and without some guidance on the front end, I have some concern in that regard.
I think that's where the 8 criteria, the regionalism, the economic. Before we get to that selection committee, there's certainly going to be more discussions at this level to direct and guide that committee on what they feel is important.
Anticipated that there'll be more talk about this criteria?
Well, we're asking the committee to adopt, or the board to adopt these criteria today, so we can include them when we put out the call for projects, so that everybody who's submitting projects knows what their projects need to match up with. That said, there's nothing, as we get closer, that the committee would start meeting in about mid-October. And certainly when they get appointed, it would be very appropriate for this board to, provide them with some guidance on what sort of, how they wanted the committee to go about applying these criteria.
I guess I'm really, all the questions that go to the same concerns I have. These 8 criteria have no weighting. What you're really going to do is what we've done in the past. We keep moving this target around, trying to come up with something that the selection committee is essentially going to sit down and be handed projects and they pick. Because we're not allowing quality of place or any of these 8 to have any particular weighting. An excellent, good, or whatever doesn't have any weighting. So if I'm putting my project together, I'm throwing it against this criteria, I can go down and think, well, I'm good, I'm bad here. But I have no sense of where that project sits until I hear back from a selection criteria that may at some point in the future get direction from this board as to what we're really interested in. And I think that when you say it takes a smaller group, it gets easier. Essentially what you're going to end up is having this board look at a bunch of cases that were at least got past that first selection criteria level and then try to choose through our own eyes at looking at all this criteria. And I think we're going backwards, just my personal opinion, we're going backwards on when this thing first started, we put together a point system, if you will, that essentially set these projects out in a way that you knew where you stood. And from a small community, whether I've got representation on the board that looks at these, I read through all these criteria, and as a small community, I probably am not going to get anything above a good, maybe 1. And so you're channeling everything into your major projects within WAMPO to even consider competitive the way you're doing this. So I don't support I don't know that these 8 criteria are wrong. I'm not suggesting that. But I'm suggesting the way we're forming this and handing this over to a committee to make a decision on something they don't even know how to rate, it's all going to come down to their personal opinion at the time they're looking at it. Not, this criteria will actually probably mean nothing, my opinion.
Thoughts? It's where we want to go.
Can I ask a follow-up question? The criteria we've used in the past, where we've got to projects that have made the list, why has that failed us? What in that did you get the feedback from who that says this criteria did not end up surfacing the necessary projects to give us a sense as to why we're making this change again versus what we had?
So as I said in response to an earlier question, these are sort of an evolution of the criteria that we've used for the TIP, the past two TIP funding cycles. And there's a lot of commonality, but because when this board adopted the vision and the outcomes, those included some elements that just hadn't been taken into account in the TIP criteria. That's responsible for a lot of the changes here to add some of these talent retention areas and emphasize safety more, for instance. So it's really the bulk of the updates, the bulk of the substantive updates are to take into account these changes in our goals compared to what we were looking at in Move 2040 in the past two TIP cycles. There have been some other changes just to, as I said, to try and organize these a little better and make them a little cleaner, but those are less in terms of substantive changes and more just reorganization.
Were you here when the last TIP update happened? And if so, did they have weighting on a numbered system, a numerical system to come up with rankings, or was it exactly like this? This just has a couple more criteria.
Well, I don't know. I didn't sit on the last one. I sat on the one before. And that's exactly what we did as a selection criteria. We had all this information. We sit down and we went through what we thought. And it was just, this one connects with this one, so that's a good one. And it really got down to a discussion in a room about the projects on the table, which one we thought. And so now we've got even more categories instead of less. And I just think the selection committee is being put in a position that's going to be very hard to defend their selections based on criteria. If we're going to use criteria, if we're going to have well, it's not quantified, but we're going to have criteria, it needs to be defensible for those projects that didn't make it. Somebody needs to understand why they didn't make it.
So this system really is the same as before, it just has more criteria.
I don't see a lot of difference. But I just would be interested in last time, if the projects were selected or weren't selected, did you get feedback that system did not work? Or the one before that? I mean, we keep changing. What are we trying to ultimately get to? So this governing body has everybody confidence that when we sit down, because no one in this room is going to have time to go through all these. When we sit down and say, here's the top 20 and here's the 10 that made it based on this criteria, everyone in this room feels comfortable that that's a good vetting process.
And I've got a question. I'm going to try to tag on to what Bert's saying. So you're saying basically if you've got the criteria, there ought to be some kind of weighting with it tied to it? Because we've tried that in the past too, and you end up gaming around the points. So, I mean.
Yeah, I'm looking around the table. There are a fair number of you who were here during the development of Move 2040, and some of you may remember we started out with a very points and rating based system for the Move 2040 process. And basically, because of dissatisfaction from the policy body and the TAC with the results of that, the project selection committee essentially ended up throwing those out and doing their selection really without much in the way of criteria at all. So this is kind of trying to find a happy medium between the free-for-all and the very numeric-based system that we initially started with in Move 2040.
Go back to the previous meeting we just had. The other thing that needs to fold into place here is the concern we had in our last meeting about maintaining flexibility. So all this work's going to get done, and based on when these projects are selected, whatever the hot really need is going to surface to the top if we follow the flexibility. So I don't know the answer. I'm not trying to be critical. I'm just saying we're setting ourselves up for a lot of work to go into something that I don't know that has the confidence to spit out the end product that we really want to do. If the caveat to all of it is do all this, but be flexible so we can pick what we want. And then who's we to pick whatever we want based on what's needed at the time.
I can go back to what we talked about last month. We only have $12 million a year, roughly, right? And so as I look through the criteria and how projects could score, and I understand the concern and sometimes controversy around weighting. It seems that everything at least ought to look through the prism of regionalism, or what we've talked about as regional significance. And to me, that's almost a knockout factor, right? Because we do have such limited dollars, we want to make sure that we are moving the region forward on projects that we fund. Some of the, and if we don't use that as the first review, then I think we're going to have a whole lot of local projects that could get submitted and score. Again, I think somebody could game the system a little bit by the way that they put their projects together. Because there is a lot of overlap here when it comes to some of the multimodal issues, as well as the quality of life seems to also then blend into a few of the other factors as well. But I would offer that at least as a starting point, that if we're not going to weight each of these, at least we look at regionalism as being the first thing that a project has to check a box before it can move forward.
We got to make sure too, when we're doing these weightings, and I mean, granted, regionalism is big, but we got to make sure that it's also fair for all the communities. What may seem regionally significant, and they'll use Derby and Hayesville for an instance, may not seem regionally significant there. I mean, so, and while I see what you're saying, I think sometimes regionalism is our ultimate goal. We also have to realize that it's not always just about the core. It's got to be about the areas too. So, while that's very important, I think if we could come up with some weighing systems, but you're always going to have a human factor in how you weigh those things out too. I mean, the last one, I mean, we had the 5 folks on that committee rated a lot of different projects a lot of different ways. So we didn't all come in and say, yeah, this is excellent or this is not applicable or whatever. I mean, there was some thought process there. So, I don't know what it's, I don't guess I know how to move forward to this at this point. Donna, you got something?
Chris, you're not trying to pull together how we're going to use that data. You're just showing the data that you'd like to be part of the process, right, today?
Yeah, so what I'm asking for today is action on these criteria, so we can put them, essentially we have to put a questionnaire together that gathers all this data when we do the call for projects.
So you're way out in front of deciding how you're going to use it or how you're going to weight it and stuff. All you're saying is this is the data we want to use or incorporate with what we've got.
Well, I don't know that we would want to wait until after folks have submitted their projects and then say how we're going to weight it here. We really need to tell them upfront.
Today, you're just asking us to incorporate those items as part of the process.
Yeah, we're asking for approval of these criteria.
Different than, I understand where Bert's at exactly, but we're not there yet, right? Or is there going to be some additional information?
I think this document's more holistic than that. It's the criteria, but it's also accepting the rating system of excellent, good, acceptable. It's putting together, if I understand what Chris started, walk away from here, he can put together a process that goes out to every community that says, here's how you submit your projects. And every community then will have these guidelines, the criteria, and a scoring system, whether it's excellence of 5 and a 4 or 3, it doesn't matter, but they'll be able to see. And I don't mind that for the first blush as saying, okay, everything I do is good. I don't stand a chance. I'm not even going to submit this. That's a good screening, and that's what we talked the other day. Is this purely an elimination process that allows people to go through and say, mine isn't even competitive. I shouldn't even be sending it forward. And I think to the point of, if we have, of those 8, if 3 of them are considered rated the top, they all must touch this at some way, then that even helps the communities know that the particular project is not going to make it. It may not mean they can't still plan for it and put it together to try to figure out what to do with it, but as far as competing for the WAMPO dollars, it's not going to be competitive. And then the selection committee, I think, is going to be faced with the same situation, is they've now got the same criteria and the same scoring, And quite frankly, I think they'll go right back through that process again at their level. And so it's gonna have to have some weight to it, or you're not gonna have any way to funnel that into conclusion.
Jack?
In listening to this, it sounds like regionalism is kind of the knockout factor when I listen to everybody. I'm thinking that you get to the regional decision, that if there's an issue, to send it back to the TAC, which I want to see involved in this, to really kind of mull it over and look at what's right, because they're the people that have the knowledge to whether regionally it makes sense.
Okay.
Okay, I guess I have a question that somebody could probably answer. So we have, is it still 23 entities on WAMPO? Is that correct?
We have what, Troy?
23 entities that make up WAMPO, right? So the goal of all of this, I think, is to have the criteria, some kind of a ranking within the criteria, and come up with a list of projects. And I think all of us, except probably Sedgwick County and Wichita, are scared crapless that all of that, if you were to rank everything, would be the Northeast Junction or Kellogg within Wichita. I think that's probably fair to say. And then with that, I think that the committee then, in addition to any criteria that we put together, still has to look at the word fairness to all the entities that make up this body. So once you do that, it kind of breaks a numerical ranking anyway, which is probably why that committee is going to have a long discussion on all the projects, because it can't just be numerical, especially if it turns out to be very unfair to pretty much everybody, I think. So while I certainly give credence to the numerical because and the knockout, because if it's not regional, then why the heck would it be part of WAMPO anyway? But outside of that one, everything else is, in my mind, something that maybe should be looked at. But once you look at it, you still have to probably rearrange projects for the fairness factor, which you can't quantify, I don't think, in my opinion. So when I look at all the discussion we're having, yes, I mean, it needs to go through a committee that understands fully what it means to be regional and what all the projects mean in that way, as well as how they rank within the different criteria. But I don't know how you're going to get a committee that's going to be fair. I'm just throwing that out there, because you're going to have 5 people on it, it sounds like, and only maybe a couple of the entities represented. So I think that the point was brought up earlier too, that we need to make sure that there's people that are part of the outlying communities, not just Wichita and Sedgwick County as part of it. So.
That gets back in the final why in the past we've gone out and brought in people that were part of this body, and then people that weren't part of this body to go through interviews with the people that were presenting the packages, and they selected them that way. And it put everything out there, verbal stuff that you couldn't get in writing that went with that package, and they selected them that way in the past. So there was an interview process where you came in and presented your proposal.
Still happens.
Well, I know, but I mean, that it got, if you can't just look on paper and decide what's the best package,
I think that part of what's going to come down for all of us, I think, is that whoever's part of the committee, we have to trust them fully that they're representing us individually. So how do we come up with that committee? Is it just selected by Chris or by you? Or, I mean, do we have a say-so in that, or is it already done?
It's not already done. According to the bylaws, committees like this are appointed by the policy body chair.
Last one, like I said, he had a rep from Sedgwick, myself, and then a community member, so that wasn't on either the TAC or the policy board to go through all the criteria, so you had somebody that had no ties.
I did one before that, and we brought Keith Lawing in, and he chaired it and brought some people in from Wichita, Sedgwick County, and different places to go through the packages. So
The big two, I mean, the Sedgwick County and Wichita each had one rep, and I mean, there was a total of 5, so it was not like they, and they were, did a good job. I mean, they look at it as a whole. I think they represented not only the represented the communities as a whole very well.
But did anybody have problems with the projects that were selected last time? I think that was Bert's question kind of earlier. I didn't. Looking at everything I've been in the last few years on WAMPO, I felt like all the projects that came through were appropriate. But I don't know if everybody feels the same way I do. That might be a question to answer. And if so, then we're just kind of blowing a lot of hot air at this point. Because it would be,
Last year was kind of an anomaly because we had more money than projects. And so pretty much any project that was submitted got accepted. That has not, it's my understanding, that's kind of the first year that's ever happened. So if there were problems with the projects that were selected, I'd be kind of interested in hearing that. It is, sitting on the committee, it is difficult. We had several projects, and I can't remember which ones or how many, or which ones that were kind of marginally acceptable. And we had questions as to, well, if the street would have been maintained throughout the course of its life, would it be here? And if it had, is that our problem? So there's discussions that we got into like that, that I can certainly see coming up if we have way more projects than we do money, and kind of the getting into the opinions portion of it. But yeah, whatever we decide is difficult.
The one before that, there was many more projects than there was money. And so, some people, that way you did have a winners and losers, and that was on that. And I mean, there was the same questions. Is this a maintenance project? Is this a new project? Or so the vast majority of them were new projects, I think. Well, we actually relooked at this last time some of those. Meridian. That was the second time it had come through that committee. Bridge over the big ditch, the pedestrian bridge over on was that Meridian? That was one that had been approved years ago and then came back up because the bids weren't in. So I don't.
You think this criteria would reduce the number of projects being submitted?
I don't think it would have much of an effect one way or another on the overall number of projects that we see. It might, certainly I think part of the hope here is that it would affect the details of the projects, how they're fleshed out, and perhaps some of the types of projects that we get.
Well, I heard you say you wanted the communities to know what the criteria is when they're submitting their project. So
Yeah.
if they don't think this meets the criteria, then they shouldn't submit it.
I would say that of the priorities that a community has, they should compare those to the criteria and look at which of these projects seem to fit the WAMPO process best, and maybe would be best funded through this versus maybe which we should look at other mechanisms for funding, and make sure that essentially you put forward the projects that you're interested in that also have the best chance of getting funding through WAMPO because they match up with the selection criteria.
In the past, everybody just submitted everything.
I'll say in the past, there didn't seem to be a whole lot of a relation between what got submitted and what the goals of the plan were, the selection criteria.
There was no criteria or nothing to be submitted, so we just sent them all in and said, hey, you guys look at them. I guess we're really trying to look at some type of a criteria to let those community knows that don't send it to us because it doesn't meet the criteria.
That's still, the federal, one of the audit requirements last time is let us know what's going on in the region. So it may be something that doesn't pass the test in here, but it's regionally would need to be on the list. So you can't say just don't send them.
I think that's where the flexibility comes in to be able to submit.
This animal's changed over the last 5 years too. It used to be roads and bridges, and there was a couple kinds of road money and one bridge money and stuff. And now you've got electronics and other things going in looking for money, and so the things are changing. It's migrating. So.
I can piggyback on what Bruce was saying. If if I was trying to put a project together, I'd like to at least know the philosophy the committee's going to use. If it's the projects that score the most excellence, have categories where they're going to get excellent, then we probably narrow some projects or eliminate projects and go for those that hit more boxes. But if it's a matter of you just excel in one or two areas and it's considered to be regionally significant or something, I don't know. I just like to know what the philosophy is, because I think we could manage projects better, Bruce, if we know on the front end. I think you're right.
Suggestion on what they want to do.
Are we up on a timeline to make a decision on this, or it sounds like there's been enough discussion that maybe we could give staff a little direction to work this through and maybe see if there's some other recommendations to put some teeth into either the project identification or the selection criteria? Can we, I don't want to say punt, but defer it a little bit to allow you to maybe come up with a couple of different recommendations?
Well, we were planning to send out the call for projects in mid-June, so after the next policy body meeting. So there is the potential for the policy body to wait until next month to come out with it. I think that if you did want to delay, staff would want some real clear guidance from the policy body so that we would have a high level of confidence that what we came to you next time would meet the policy body's wishes. Barring that, then it would probably push back the call for projects, which we would like to avoid if possible.
Some of the categories we know that cross over, I think, as Mr. Layton says, the quality of life and the multimodal seem to cross over some. Is there some that staff may go back and say, okay, they cross over, so we're going to reduce these to not have as many of them there? If that makes any sense or not?
There are areas where they touch and maybe overlap a little bit. We tried to sort of dole them out so that each of these criteria is looking at something different. You can sort of think of them as sort of clusters in a way, that there are types of projects that might tend to score well on groups of 2 or 3 of these, but we really did try and make it so each criteria looks at a separate dimension of those projects.
Have you decided who you're going to appoint?
Haven't even started that.
Reason I ask is, I think we could get some comfort if we knew who the people were and you asked them, how are you going to interpret this? Then we'd all know on the front end how they're intending to use this criteria. Because I don't know that I'm opposed to the criteria as much as how is it going to be used. And I think as what Bert was saying, I think several people have said that.
I can tell you at the next meeting, I have not got into that process yet because I thought I had time.
I understand. I'm just trying to look at a way to get everybody comfortable.
Bert?
I seem to have a lot of objection to this. Let me kind of tell you what I think is kind of going to solve this. If this criteria went out the way it is today to all of us communities and said, you need to have your projects at least fall in line and they should be highly good or better in every category to consider submission, I think that gives the community something to work on. But I think the selection committee is the one that has to have the defined understanding of how it works. So when it gets to them, they can use that as a tool, not just a philosophy. Where Clearwater, I go through and I hit 6 of these with some goods and a couple excellents. I just have to feel confident that at least may get my foot in the door, and that's okay. That I can use that at the agency level or at the community level. But the selection criteria, when it gets to the next level, those that make it, those that don't make it, I don't know, it has to be completely revamped or anything, but that has to have some understanding meat to it, that these fall in, these fall out, and this would be why. And so it's not, to me, the users, it's those that have to do the selection. This is too vague in my mind. It's just all gonna come down to, what do you think about this one? I like this one, I like that one. And the scoring won't even matter. So if there's a way very quickly, if that's probably not good enough guidance, but staff can say to the selection committee, whoever's appointed, this is how you will use the criteria, then I think all
They're saying everything that falls below good and excellent really falls out.
I think a community would be, if I had anything good and below, I would probably think, well, I guess I'd throw it up in case I had a situation, we had more money than we have projects. I guess I could submit it, but there ought to at least be a good sense that that is not going to be a competitive product. And I go back to the point of especially if you're not strong in regionalism, economic development, or multimodal connectivity, some of those top three, if you don't at least hit in these, the chances of getting WAMPO funding, and it goes back, it's not saying it's not a good project that's not needed for our community, but if we're expecting WAMPO funding to be supportive of it, it has to hit what's regionally, and I'm a small community saying that, but I just think that that's where that criteria has to be defined, so when the selection committee gets it, 1, 2, 3, easy, set them aside, let's go through these because they meet that criteria. If there's money left, pull these back up and revisit.
Chris, what kind of direction to staff do you think you would need to come back to us with?
So I don't know that we could get to exactly what Mayor Armstrong is asking for, just because so much of whether a project will be competitive depends on how many projects we get. And that's true under this system, it's true under a true points-based system. It really depends on the other projects. How many do we get, how good are they? You know, if the committee felt strongly that or the board felt strongly that you would like a purely numeric system, we can translate this into that. If you wanted specific ratings or to prioritize these 8 areas, we could do that as well, but I don't know that I have a sense from the board what direction everyone wants to go in at this point.
I'm going to take it off the middle and make a motion to approve. We'll see where it goes.
I'll second the motion.
Okay, we have a motion and a second to approve the plan as presented, correct?
I have a question to ask before. You're looking at this to get into the projects that may end up in 2023? Or is this headed toward the next 2045 plan?
So this is 4 projects that'll go into the next MTP. While there hasn't been a final decision on it, I would also like us to use this for when we're selecting projects during our funding cycle for the TIP, but we're a couple of years from making that decision. So this would be 4 projects that are going into the MTP as our immediate use for this. We would like to make fewer changes to these criteria in the future, to get back to a previous question, and carry these forward. But the immediate decision is just for projects that are going to, this is what we'll decide what gets on the menu in the next version of the MTP.
Projects that are in the next 2 or 3 years that have already been selected and are in that process will stay in that process.
Yes, I should emphasize
Okay, 'cause I
that.
wanna get
Anything
that
that is in the
cleared out of
TIP
here.
right now, so if you've gotten funding up through 2022 for your project, that is locked in. We're not going to be changing any of those projects based on this. So the first projects that this selects would not come into would be built in 2023 or later, essentially.
Then long-term, this would be something we're looking at doing in the next long-term plan, folding it in and making it part of the criteria, okay?
Questions? We
Just
have
quick
a
question, comment. Would it be possible to expand the selection committee?
What?
To expand the numbers? I know you
I
mentioned
think
5.
it's 5. It's been bigger. It's been about 5 is the minimum. It's just, I mean, so yeah, that's a possibility. And I will come prepared next time to at least put out a tentative selection committee.
We'd be happy to make a recommendation too, so I can send an email and maybe nominate somebody or
Yeah, you
however
can
that-
turn names into Phil if you'd like, to be considered.
Could that committee be chosen and meet and say what their philosophy is, how they would use this? I know that's what you ask on how they may use it. Instead of just telling us who they are, can you pick them and then ask them how they would use this criteria? And then come back letting us know how that group would pick their criteria? I think that's what Mr. Layton had asked.
Right.
Bruce, would you consider just waiting a month on the criteria? Because I don't know that's the criteria that we're concerned about. It's how it's going to be applied, right?
I think
if
that's
Dan's
what
gonna do what
everyone-
you're
I think
asking.
what everyone's concerned is that how the criteria is going to be put together, yeah.
There'd be a lot more comfort if we knew what that group was gonna say, just as you suggested.
Yeah, as long as that gives the staff and everybody enough time to do it. I'm just trying to get it moved off of dead center. We're going nowhere.
Have a motion and a second to approve the action, the project selection criteria. All those in favor, and I'm going to have a hand vote on this, so Bethany can, all those in favor, aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Carries.
You will have a list of your potential committee for the next meeting, as well as their thoughts on how they're going to apply this criteria. Is that correct?
Try. I don't know how well I can.
Dan, can I comment on that? Instead of having poor guys come up and say, here's how I'm going to apply the criteria, what I'd like to do is have the committee selected or the nominations selected be at this meeting and have you talk about, here's the criteria and how it should all be applied, here's how it works, so they hear it, we hear it. I mean, to have somebody stand in front of us and say, I don't know how I'm going to apply it until I get the project in front of me. But I think if we go through this presentation with the committee here, this is what we've all agreed to do, here's how it's going to be used, now go do your job.
Good call, Bert. It's a good call, Bert.
Okay.
Yeah, I would be happy to do that.
Here, and then we'll go through it again. Okay?
All right.
All right. And
Thank you.
Kristen? Okay, we're going to move, we're going to, and Kent, I apologize, we're going to kind of move forward because we're stuck. Thank you. Item D, the federal safety performance measure targets.
Well, it looks like I don't get to sit down after all. So the time has come to update our targets for the safety performance measures. We have to do this every year. This is a federal requirement. But in addition to being something we have to do, I think this is a good thing to do. It's always, safety is a very important priority, and it's always good to have the opportunity to consider where we are in terms of our safety numbers. So this is part of our performance-based planning process, where we measure performance based on our goals and use those results to inform future planning. Now, there are 5 federal safety performance measures. They are the number of fatalities, the fatality rate, so fatalities per mile traveled, the number of serious injuries, the serious injury rate, and the number of non-motorized fatalities and serious injuries, which is a fancy way of saying serious injuries and fatalities among bicyclists and pedestrians. Now, there's basically 3 ways to set performance targets. One of them is to set your targets based on the current trend. So based on the numbers, this is where we see our safety data going. Second is to set targets expecting to change current trends. So if we were spending a lot of money on safety projects, we can say, well, safety is getting worse right now, but we think all this money will make it better. And then the third way is what are called aspirational targets, things like Vision Zero, where we say the only acceptable level of fatalities is no fatalities. Now, in this case, the federal government has basically ruled out that third option. We have been asked to provide actual numbers. And right now, WAMPO is not spending a lot of money on safety projects in our region. That is something that may change for the next MTP, given our conversation about the safety criteria a little earlier, is one of the things in those project selection criteria. But for right now, we're really limited to that first bullet, setting targets based on current trends. So I'm going to be talking to you quite a bit about what our current safety statistics are and where we see them going. Now, all of our safety performance measures, to dive into the nitty-gritty here, use a 5-year rolling average. You basically take the past 5 years, you add up the number of fatalities, for instance, in each year, divide by 5. The targets we're setting right now are for 2019, which means the 5 years that we're looking at are 2015 through 2019. So we actually already have data for more than half of that period. We've got data for 15, 16, and 17. We don't have 2018 data yet because KDOT hasn't finished processing it. So the only unknowns really are 2018 and 2019. So I'll be talking to you a little bit about what those first 3 years of data in this 5-year period show for some of these measures. So here is our data for the number of fatalities. And as you can see, the trend is not looking very good. As with many places, our fatalities dipped down during the Great Recession, but since then they have bounced back quite considerably. Now, our existing target, we had set a target last year for 2014 through 2018, was for 54 fatalities. And it looks like we are probably going to exceed that. It's going to be worse than we forecast a year ago. If you just look at those past 3 years, like I was referencing earlier, we're already above that. We're up to 56.3 averaged over those 3 years. And if you just extrapolate from 2011 forward, so basically that steep part of the graph on the right, that would have us up at about 59.2 fatalities. So based on our trend, that is what the staff recommended target is no more than 59 fatalities during this 5-year period. Next is fatality rate. This is the number of fatalities per 100 million vehicle miles traveled. So this basically takes into account that the fact that if we are driving more, there will be more fatalities, even if the overall level of safety is pretty much the same. It doesn't make a huge difference in our region because our VMT is not spiking up real rapidly. It does make a bit of a difference. Our existing target is 1.13 fatalities per 100 million VMT. And the 3-year average, again, is already above that. So if you extrapolate from the right side of the graph there, we're looking at about 1.22 fatalities per 100 million VMT for the 2015 through 2019 period. So that's the staff recommended target. Now moving on, do have good news, and this is a great success story for us. The number of serious injuries has had a very sustained long-term decline, as you can see here. We were up well above 200 back during the latter part of the last decade, the early part of this decade. We are already down closer to 150, and if the trends continue, we'll be even lower than that. So the target we set last year was 138 serious injuries. Based on the trend, and here we can look at the entire trend, it's very consistent. We're looking at 122 serious fatalities, and I should step back and say we are on track to meet our target that we set last year, the 138 target. So based on the trend, the staff recommended target is no more than 123 serious injuries. Sorry, fatalities should not be on there. Looking at the serious injury rate, again, if we take into account the fact that we're driving more, our previous target was 2.85 per 100 million VMT. Based on the trend, we would expect about 2.4. And just to give you an idea of the magnitude of the improvement that we've seen here, if you look over towards the left side of the graph, we were up above 5 serious injuries per 100 million VMT. And now I'm basically asking you to set a target that is less than half of that. So that is a big improvement. And finally, non-motorized fatalities and serious injuries, and this is one where I really don't quite know what to tell you. This is an area where the numbers jump around quite a bit each year. The 5-year average kind of conceals that, but if you were to look at individual year data, it's up, it's down, it's up, it's down. It was looking up through last year that we had an upward trend. That's why we set our target at about 35 per year. But the most recent year of data basically interrupted that trend. And at this point, I can't tell you if that is just a brief blip and it'll go back to increasing, or if this is an actual leveling off or even declining. We really don't have enough data to say. So on this one, I'm going to kind of punt and say just staff recommendation is to keep the target at 35 per year where it was last year. And next year, as we see some more data, how this develops, maybe we'll be able to tell you something a little more definite. So that's essentially the story. To sum up very briefly, fatalities is not good news. We continue to see increases there. Serious injuries, very good news. We have the sustained long-term decline. Non-motorized fatalities and serious injuries, difficult to say just because the data is so volatile. So options, approve the targets, not approve the targets, or approve them with specific changes.
Well, we do.
So, as I said, the idea with performance-based planning is we use this to inform future changes. And when we were going out and doing our public engagement, for example, for the long-range plan, we talked quite a bit about the safety statistics. And among other things, they inform things like the project selection criteria and emphasis on safety there. There is not, while we are federally required to track and report these, there are not any sort of direct consequences for us in terms of funding or how we can spend our money. It is basically something that they want us to be aware of and to report on, kind of in the hopes that it will influence our decisions, and I think it does, but we are not sort of forced at federal regulation point to do any specific actions based on what we set for targets or whether we do or do not hit these particular targets.
Federal, the target rates as presented.
Moved and seconded to approve as presented. Any discussion?
I just have a question on the fatality rate. Is that an accident that had a fatality? So, God forbid, if a van full of kids and now you have 10 in one accident, that would dramatically, you know.
This is the number of individuals killed. So if you have multiple people killed in a single accident, it counts multiple times in both this and in the raw fatality numbers.
I guess in my mind, I think that would not be accurate. I feel like it would be the number of individual accidents that resulted in a death, not the number of people that were killed, because again, you could have one accident and it'd be insanely not a lot of people, and that would completely
I wouldn't say that's necessarily not a valid way to look at it, but this is one of those where how we look at it has been dictated by the federal government, and they say use the overall number.
Motion and a second to approve the safety performance measure as presented. All those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed, motion carries. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Kristen, the MTP financial.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Kristen Zimmerman, Senior Planner here at WAMPO, and I'm here today for another action item for your consideration that has to do with our ongoing Metropolitan Transportation Plan. So you had a lengthy discussion about the selection criteria. In the past few meetings, you've taken action on the vision and goals for the plan, and I'm here today to talk about a little bit different aspect of the MTP that we're working on, and specifically it's the financial analysis portion of the plan. So the overall purpose of the financial analysis section is to demonstrate that the region, to show how the region will pay for all of the projects and strategies that are in the plan, as well as pay for ongoing operations and maintenance of the system to ensure that the current system stays at an adequate condition, and accounting for deferred maintenance and debt obligations. So I am here today to ask you to vote on two key assumptions that are part of this financial analysis. The first is what the annual inflation rate will be that we will use to apply to the project cost to project what their cost will be in the future. That's one thing we have to do, is to show the cost. It's what's called in the year of expenditure. So we know what it costs today, and then we apply the inflation rate to the cost when the cost will be incurred in the future for construction, right-of-way acquisition, those sorts of things. And then the second thing I'll be asking you to take action on is our funding assumptions for future funding for the regional system. So I will be presenting to you the recommendation that came out of the advisory committee that's working on this plan. So before we jump to the recommendations, I want to spend just a brief moment to give you a sense of what goes into the financial plan, the structure of it. You can see that it's broken into two sections. One has to do with funding and the other has to do with cost. Again, what we're really doing is comparing, do we have enough money to pay for all the costs that we're expecting to be incurred? That's really the big question we're trying to answer here. And you can see there's several assumptions that goes into each of these two components. And again, today we'll be focusing on funding assumptions as well as inflation assumptions. I did want to share with you one exciting thing, or we think it's exciting for this time around with the plan, is that we have a better handle on how to make assumptions about the region's financial well-being. Obviously, none of us have a crystal ball. We're sort of making these assumptions based on the information we know now, but we were really happy to get some projections from the WSU Center for Economic Development and Business Research, Jeremy Hill's group. And they provided us projections of taxable sales and assessed valuations for our region. And those projections were developed using a model that looked at projected employment, population, as well as wages. So we were happy to see that this wages component was added, and it was sort of a proxy for maybe how the financial well-being of the region will be in the future. So just wanted to share that with you. We're glad to be able to add that component. So let's jump into this first assumption, first thing we're asking you to vote on, and this is the projected inflation rate. We are recommending a rate of 4.25% for several reasons. This is in line with nationwide construction industry trends. Over the last 20 years, the nationwide inflation rate for all types of construction was 4.2% after taking out 2 of the worst years of the Great Recession. This is consistent with the inflation rate we used in the last plan, which was 4%, consistent with the rate KDOT uses, 4.5%. And this did seem reasonable when we asked some engineers from local governments and from KDOT that regularly bid, road and bridge capital construction projects. This seemed like a reasonable rate. So that's the first thing we're asking you to vote on today is this inflation. And then we'll shift gears and talk about the second thing we'll ask you to vote on today, and that has to do with the funding sources. So these entities that are listed here all contribute in some form or fashion to building, maintaining, operating, providing transportation services on our regional system. We focus on these first 3 because they're supported by some form of public taxes, whether they're property taxes, sales taxes, gas taxes, income taxes. Of course, the Kansas Turnpike Authority manages the portion of I-135 going through our region, and then there's public or private services like Uber, Lyft, Greyhound, taxis, but we focus on the government provided ones. And before we jump into the numbers, I just wanted to put this map up here as a sort of a reminder of what the regional system is. So this map is a map of the road and highway portion of our regional system. The regional system also includes all the public transit services that are primarily provided by Wichita Transit, as well as the public paratransit services that are provided also by Wichita Transit and a few other providers. Includes all the technology on here, as well as some of the bicycle and pedestrian network. So this entire system is owned and operated by 14 individual local governments, the state of Kansas, and also the Kansas Turnpike Authority. And all of these local governments all work together to build the system and keep it up as it is. And we know that each of you go through your own internal processes when you do your own budgets and CIP to make your own decisions on how you want to build and finance and manage the portion of the regional network that's within your own jurisdiction. Here at WAMPO, we like to look at the system as a whole, as a sort of a systems analysis look. So the financial plan will really look at some overall themes, trends, trajectories, and revenues, funding, debt, that sort of thing. And this is another reason we bring these decisions to you as owners and operators of a portion of the regional network. You have a vested interest in making sure it's operating properly and within your own priorities. And we also bring it to you as members of our board that you also can view the view the system as the system-wide, from the kind of the WAMPO perspective, in addition to seeing the portion within your own jurisdiction. So let's jump into the numbers. Here's some historical data for you. This is data represents over the last 5 years. On average, the region has spent about $170 million a year on our regional transportation system. You can see the breakout there in the pie chart. Local governments do the heavy lifting around here. They contributed 77 million of the 170, or approximately 45%, through spending of sales taxes and property tax revenues. KDOT is the second largest contributor. You can see that's a mix of both state and federal funding. They came in at about 67 million of the 170, or about 40% of the total spending. That comes through two main programs. One is their long kind of 10-year program, that's T-Works, their T-Works program. And then they also contribute through the state statute mandated special city county highway fund, where the state shares a portion of the state gas tax with cities and counties. And then the federal government is the smallest contributor to the transportation system in our region at about 26 million, or 15%. And the federal government money comes to us in really two ways. One is directly to the region, so that's 2 of 3 WAMPO's funding programs, as well as Wichita Transit's federal funding that comes directly to those organizations. And then also KDOT chooses to share some of its federal funding with WAMPO and also with the counties in our region. So hopefully this gives you a sense of kind of some of the historical data where we're at now. Again, this is an average over the last 5 years. Your advisory committee for the plan spent their last meeting looking at this, and also looking at different policy scenarios for each of these funding sources in order to bring a recommendation to you for your consideration. So we'll go through those next. So we'll start with the biggest contributor to our transportation system, local sales tax. It provides about 40 million per year to the transportation system. Many of you probably know Sedgwick County passed a 1-cent sales tax back in the mid-'80s, and had an associated resolution that said half of the proceeds would go to property tax relief and half would go to roads and bridges. They are required per state statute to share that with all the incorporated cities in the region, and many of those cities also have their own similar ordinances or resolution that also calls for about 50% to go to property tax relief and 50% to roads and bridges. Many of you probably know, this is the same funding source the city of Wichita used over the last 30 years or so to take to do all the upgrades on Kellogg through the region. So this is really the biggest source of funding for the transportation system in our region. In addition to Sedgwick County, the cities of Hayesville, Andover, and Goddard also have their own sales tax in place for their own jurisdiction, and a portion or all of that goes to transportation needs in their jurisdiction. So your advisory committee looked at 3 different scenarios here. You can see the orange line is the actual funding, again, right around 40 million a year. They looked at the 3 scenarios. The top one, the black line, was to be what if there was an additional 1-cent sales tax that went entirely to transportation. That was an option. The second option was the gray line, was where we would use the entirety of the current 1-cent sales tax that's in place right now, not just the 50% to transportation. And then the blue line is sort of the current policy and practice. And they are recommending that blue line for your consideration, mostly because there hasn't been very much real serious conversation about changes in sales tax. So that's their recommendation to you for that. The second biggest contributor is local property taxes. That contributes right around 30 to 40 million per year, and it roughly is equal to about 15% of the total property taxes collected in each jurisdiction that owns a portion of the regional network. So it's about 15% is allocated to transportation. And again, your advisory committee looked at a couple different scenarios. You can see the actual data there on the blue line. The gray line represents a scenario of the current mill levy stays in place, and that percentage would be bumped up 10%. So within internal budgeting, the 15% would go up to 25% to transportation, and then the orange line represents current policies and practices where we keep that about 15% of total property tax revenues going to transportation. Again, they're recommending that sort of the current policies and practice continue on. Again, no real serious conversations about changes in any of this, and also many of you are probably very familiar with the property tax lid that local governments have to comply with here in across the whole state, not just our region. Okay, so we talked about local contributions. We'll shift gears here to the KDOT program. Many of you are probably familiar with the T-Works program. Our state is one of, I think, maybe the only state in the country that has had this long history of passing these, 10-year bills for transportation. Most states manage their transportation year by year. We're very fortunate where our state has chosen to manage it in kind of 10-year blocks. They've done it for the last 30 years. The current program expires next year in 2020. And your advisory committee looked at several different options. You can see there in the green line is the actual funding. They looked at different policy scenarios from what if there was a big significant increase represented on the blue line of 25% each 5-year bill, to the black line is on historical trend. The orange line is a marginal nominal increase, maybe like 1% per year. And the yellow is the flat line from the current bill, and then 0 represents zero investment after the current year expires, where the state would decide to get out of the business of transportation. So our committee and most of us know there's tremendous uncertainty at the state level for transportation, and so they are recommending that it's our assumption is it's flatline from the current program. Many of the members recognize that perhaps some of you around the table might have the ear of some of the folks in the legislature and might have a better sense of what the state legislature is thinking about this program. We know nothing new has been introduced during this legislative session, but would definitely be open to your input on this assumption. And then our last two have to do with federal funding. This one represents, again, that direct funding coming to the region. It's roughly about $20 million a year or so. And again, this is a combination of what's directly coming to Wichita Transit, as well as 2 out of the 3 WAMPO programs. You can see the historical number there in the yellow. And again, they looked at these same 5 scenarios that we talked about with the KDOT program. And they are recommending this green line, which is the marginal or nominal increase of about 1% per year. Again, lots of uncertainty, like with the state, lots of uncertainty at the federal level, lots of things taking place up on Capitol Hill. So the current legislation is scheduled to expire next year in 2020, and so they are recommending this as the most likely and most reasonable assumption to be made at this point with the information we have. And then the last one, again, is the smallest contributor to transportation in our region, right around $5 million. This is federal funding that KDOT chooses to share with a portion of it with WAMPO and then with the counties in our region. Again, looked at those same 5 policy scenarios, and the committee is recommending to stay on historical trend for this one. Again, just based on the tremendous uncertainty, again, at both the state and federal level. So this slide summarizes all of the policy assumptions that your advisory committee is recommending to you for all of these 5 different funding sources. Again, we're sort of planning for the entirety of the system and do have to make these assumptions on behalf of when we don't necessarily know all the information and are sort of charged to choose the most likely and the most reasonable option here. I did want to draw your attention to the bottom row there. You can see we're also including an assumption of a $10 million federal competitive grant that this region might get in this first time band of the plan. So many of you probably are familiar with the Tiger program or the Build program. So we're building that into our financial assumptions in the event a local government here were to receive one of those. So these are the assumptions coming to you from your advisory committee. That group thought these were the most likely and most reasonable given the information we have. I just wanted to go through a few slides on sort of, well, what's the implication of these assumptions? What does that mean for us? What position does that put us in? So after all this is all added up, you can see the light blue line is the actual funding. Again, we're right around 170 million over this last year, and then the dark blue line is the projected funding. We're growing, historically grew at just under 4% per year, and projecting to grow right around 1.4% per year going forward, which is pretty consistent with the sort of population employment projections you've probably seen for this region, you know, around 1% per year. That looks fairly reasonable. And then when we plot it against purchasing power, the story changes. So you can still see those same lines of light blue is actual and dark blue is the projected using these assumptions. And this green line is purchasing power. So that's after we've taken into account inflation, both in the past and in the future. So the purchasing power line here is based on 2017 dollars. And you can see, obviously, that is a downward trend. So at the rate of just about 2.5% per year, these assumptions are obviously not keeping up with inflation. And this is, again, based on this 4.25% rate I talked about earlier in the presentation. So that's kind of the main takeaway for the funding implications for the sort of the totality of these assumptions. When we're looking at just the WAMPO funding program, many of you know we generally talk about 12 million per year. You can see historically what we're doing. These assumptions would assume roughly about that same 12 million per year for many years into the future. And of course, the purchasing power story is the same on this front. The actual funding is pretty flat, and you can see the purchasing power in a downward trend at just about the same rate, about 2.5% decline per year, given the purchasing power. So where does that leave us all? Well, we've spent the last few months collecting all this data. I want to thank all of your staff. They've been a huge help in compiling all of this. Over the next few months, as we are starting to get some projects in, we'll go through the process of projecting the cost using the approved inflation rate, and then we'll start comparing those total cost with these revenue assumptions. The biggest impact here, of course, will be for the WAMPO funding, where we'll only be able to plan for the same number of projects as we have funding for. And then we're also going to be going through a process of assessing the impacts of debt and deferred maintenance on this overall funding picture. So because the financial plan will show sort of our total revenues, and of that, how much is going to new projects in the plan, how much will go to operations and maintenance, how much will go to deferred maintenance, and then also to debt. So this is an action item. We are asking you to take a vote on these two items, the inflation rate and the funding assumptions, and I'm glad to answer any questions you might have on this.
Rate assumption and the
Up or down, it doesn't affect anything but our funding. So are we mandated as a board to do this vote?
No, you're not federally mandated. The reason we're bringing this to you is this is one of the decision points that was part of the approach the board approved last summer, I guess, on which decision items within the planning process the board would want to have a vote on. And both of these were included within that.
A motion to approve.
Second.
moved and seconded. Any further discussion? If not, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, motion carries. Okay, 2019 year-end balance options.
Okay, the day has finally come when we're going to vote on this. So I don't know if you guys are excited as I am, but I'm very excited about this. So you probably know over the last few months we've been talking about this. We've requested input from your advisory committees, from your city managers, your administrators. We've whittled down the list of possible candidates, had a lot of back and forth on what was eligible. We've got our final list of 17, and we're ready for a vote. So over the last 3 weeks, to sort of prepare for this vote, we did open a poll for those of you that chose to participate in, of these 17 candidate projects, you could rank them in your preferred priority order. We heard from 9 of you, and here was the results from those 9. And as I'm going over this, I should note there is a handout on your station there that has all the 17 projects. So of the 9 of you we heard from, this was the preferred order. The project that came in first was to contribute to the North Junction Gold Phase right-of-way. The one that came in second was to award additional funding to a project on 17th Street in Wichita. The third priority was to move forward a reimbursement up on the Redbud Path project to connect one of the missing segments on that trail up there. The fourth project was to contribute to a fiber project in downtown Wichita. And then the fifth priority was to award additional funding again to that Redbud project. And again, this was, we put this poll out there just to sort of have a starting point for this conversation and action today. So we took those results and put it into this proposal for your consideration. So we've got the top 5 listed there. You'll see on the top line, we are going to take out $100,000 of a balance to handle any last minute changes. As you probably have a sense, we do not know the amount of money we have to work with. We won't know. We'll have a little bit more certainty in July. We'll have a lot of certainty in September. But between now and then, we do need you to provide us kind of some funding targets so that we can get all the paperwork and take care of all the details that need to get taken care of. So again, this is a starting point proposal for you. In addition to the funding uncertainty, I did want to say that these targets, we will, whatever you vote on for the targets, we will definitely shoot for. But given the uncertainty of the amount, we'll be sure to be coming back with the exact amounts we'll have in July. And before I open it up to discussion, I did want to make one change. Since this list was finalized, we did hear from Wichita Transit, and they asked us to remove the multimodal center from the project list and replace it with a replacement bus purchase. So in between, when we put this together, they had had some conversations with Federal Transit Administration and asked us to take that off. So with that, I'd be glad to take any questions. Again, we're asking for action today. Your options are to approve the proposal as it's laid out or propose something different.
We have 400,000 supposedly available.
That's our estimate as of May 1st.
12 million, 9 million, and so on and so forth. But we know those are not going to happen because there's only 400,000 there. So what are those for?
That's the maximum amount that these projects could take. And I put that on there to get at just your point that you're making, is that the amount that we'd be contributing is pretty small versus the entirety of the cost of the project.
Cost of the project.
The federal portion. The federal portion, yes, yes.
My question on that is additional funding. Were those projects funded at 80/20? Or is this something that they were funded at less than and we can contribute to it?
That's right. In the case of both of these on here to award additional funding, the 17th and the Redbud, yes, they were both originally funded at that. Since those original funding amounts happened, 2 things. One, on 17th Street, there was the cost, I want to say even almost doubled due to some work with the railroad at that project. And then on the Redbud Path project, it was again almost a doubling of the cost due to some additional drainage structures that were found during some of the initial assessment work. So some of this is a result of, when the projects first come on WAMPO's radar, it's 4 or 5 years out. And during that time period, the sponsor has a chance to do some initial work and start to refine the scope, and they costs can change during that process.
Your percentage is done by the number of votes. 60% of the votes were for.
Nope. That percentage, that's something Phil had come up with and wanted me to use. So I think it was just sort of a way to divvy up the points. So this group has full discretion on how to use this.
Criteria is for the percentage then?
Well, no, it's,
Whatever Phil decided he's gonna give us.
well, that's what he had come up with and wanted me to use, yes.
Percentage?
Yes, yes, this is really a starting point. So you can give, 1/17 to all 17 projects. You can give all of it to one project. You can do, 10% to 10 projects. It's really up to the group. So if you'd like to have a conversation, I do have a spreadsheet we can pull up and start plugging in numbers if that would be helpful.
Been discussing all along is the North Junction. That's what we keep saying is our number one project. And I have no idea, I'm sorry, but I have no idea what the benefit of the Redbud Path is. And you're putting better than $2 million in the Redbud Path when our number one priority is the North Junction. So I won't vote for it.
And I should clarify that this is just the maximum federal amount. It's not the amount that would be awarded.
It's only got $300,000 divided up between these 17.
That's correct. As of May 1st, the amount can change, but that's our estimate right now.
At 100,000 for last minute change, so we got roughly $300,000. And I mean, 60%, that's or the 9.6 is total amount. So you want all 300,000 to go to.
That's the decision of the board.
No, I'm asking Dennis. We got
1.5 million in the Redbud and then another 700,000 in the Redbud. So we got over.
That's the max.
But
Say again?
no, all we're voting on is on the 300,000. This leftover money. These projects have been approved. They're already projects that are in the hopper. This is just if they need it. They may not be at the 80-20 split, correct? So if there's additional money that can go to them to get to that 80-20 split as a maximum, or, I mean, we're not voting on the 9.6, 2.8, 1.5. That's already gone. This is just the leftover money, the $300,000 on where you want to put additional dollars. Since we can't roll it over like we used to roll it over and then next year we'd add it to the TIP program. Now we've got to come up with a way to spend it during this.
And then
Yeah,
60, 20, 10, 6, and 4, is that a percent you're, at least based on what you're recommending, of the 300,000, the junction would get 60% of that 300,000, 17th Street, 20% of the 300,000?
That's right.
That's what that percentage is.
That's right. Yeah, let me pull up this spreadsheet. Maybe that will be more clear.
Top end would be 180,000 to the North Junction.
Yeah, so you'd want to look at this column C. Let me highlight it here for the dollar amount. And again, this is based on our current estimate. What you're really voting on today is the funding target, the percentages, and the project. So this would give you the amount.
100,000 is ready to be allocated today? It's available to be allocated to these projects, or what's the step?
Nope. What happens is today you'll provide some guidance on these percentages, the targets you'd like for us to meet. We'll keep monitoring the amount. We'll know with a little bit more certainty in July. So between now and July, we'll have to finalize a lot of the details. Some of these require a match. We'll have to assess tip fees on some of these. We'll get them into our next tip amendment, which will come to you in July. At that point, you'll see the final projects, the final amounts that are in the tip amendment, and then we'll continue to monitor it through October, when we'll know with certainty what the amounts are, and I guess in September. And then in September, we'll know with certainty what the amounts are that they could get.
Voting on today would be to lock in the percentage.
That's correct. To provide guidance to staff on getting the TIP amendment processes in place so we can, because all the projects have to be in our TIP and then have to go to KDOT to get into their TIP, and take care of some paperwork that needs to, like, for example, there'll have to be an agreement between KDOT and the jurisdiction to receive this additional funding. So things like that.
Or what criteria you use to pick the percentages?
No,
So
no.
and Phil's not here to tell us.
Looked at the numbers though, I mean, it pretty much matched up with what the total dollar amount for those projects were percentage wise. So it appears.
I don't know if he used that or not. Could be.
Okay.
Yeah, could be.
I think that's exactly what it is. If you go back to the other one, it's a percentage of the total against what their total projects are, and he just allocated those out. It looks like to me. This is another one of those ones, I don't know how you get to an answer, other than, to Commissioner's point, you know, the biggest dog on the street right now is the North Junction. And if in fact we have additional money trying to get that thing done, I don't know why you would try to take a small $12,000 and put it to something when that money could be available to push this project forward and regionally significant. That's the biggest thing we got going on right now. So.
Then I guess we could entertain a motion to put all the money into North Junction.
So moved.
Second.
Motion and a second. All the money goes to North Junction. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Aye.
All right, committee updates. We did not meet as an executive committee last month. We're meeting next week, so we'll have a report next month. Tom, you got anything for TAC?
The only thing that we did at TAC that wasn't covered today is we got the vehicle to grid presentation, and that was quite interesting on electric cars and alternatives to gas.
Okay, Kansas Department of Transportation, Brent, you have anything for us?
We had a VE meeting just this week on the North Junction project, some pretty interesting. That's where a team comes in, looks at the project, sees what kind of improvements could be made, some kind of make something better. Reports due back to us in a couple of weeks, so. Bit of an update on it.
Thank you.
Do you want to know?
I have a question. North of 45th Street, right alongside of 135, you're borrowing dirt. Will that come back, or is that going to be another pond up there?
Thing right now to put the dirt back in that location. I can't answer whether.
Getting close to water, so.
Thank you. With that, is there any other business before the board? If not, we stand adjourned.